Thank you so much for coming this evening to share with us the confessions of the band Geek. Jen, you've been at Allegheny for how long now?
8 years.
8 years. So you're coming to share us some information about brass band.
Correct. Yeah.
Welcome. Thank you.
So thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for inviting me to be here. So as I said, I've been teaching at Allegheny since 2007. I am the orchestra director there. I also teach music theory, and I also teach trumpet lessons, which is my first love. And in addition to that, I am a performing musician when I'm not teaching, and so my main performing gig is with a brass band in Pittsburgh called River City Brass, and I've been playing there for 7 years now. I started there in 2008. And so being a performing musician is a bit different than your typical 9-to-5 job in that we generally work evenings and weekends and holidays so that people who are working 9-to-5 jobs can come see our concerts and be entertained by those things. So it can be very challenging, very tiring. There's a lot of driving and commuting. But it's also very rewarding because we get to meet lots of great people who are very appreciative of the music that we make, and we get to travel to all kinds of new places. Whether either in the brass band or from my own solo performing, I've traveled to several countries, several different states. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been a really interesting career so far. So before we go much further, I want to have a little audience participation so you guys can kind of feel what it's like to be a brass player. So we're going to do kind of the basic, there's 2 basic steps to playing a brass instrument. And that's, first of all, we're going to make the sound. And the way you do that is with your lips. So there's 2 steps. The first step is just to say the syllable M and then hold your lips there. So you're just going to go M. So let's try that. M. Right. So once we get to that step, we're going to blow air through the middle of our lips, but hold our corners tight. So it's going to sound like this. M. Okay? All right, so let's try that all together. So here we go. M. Hey, not bad. Now do that for 2 more hours and you've got a brass band concert. Okay, so brass instruments, before we talk about the band, but brass instruments have been around since ancient times. They actually found primitive trumpets in King Tutankhamun's tomb. And so basically they have been around since humans learned to create alloys and bend metal. So brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, and that particular alloy is very malleable, meaning that you can bend it very easily. And as you can see from the picture here, that's a picture of a trumpet. All our brass instruments are basically just tubes, and these tubes are, you have to bend the metal into the tube first of all, and then there's several more bends around as well. So brass is particularly useful for that purpose. And there are 2 things that all brass instruments have in common. It's a fairly diverse family. If you look at the trumpet and cornet versus the tuba and French horn, they look pretty different. But they all have 2 things in common. The first of which is the use of the embouchure, which is what we all just did, that lip buzzing. And so that lip buzzing that the performer does is then channeled into the instrument through a mouthpiece. And all brass instruments use mouthpieces. They'll look a bit different. Some are cup-shaped like this one. Some are more funnel-shaped. So I'm actually going to pass this around in case you haven't seen one. And it is clean, so as long as nobody licks it, we're all good. And so brass instruments, when they were initially made, were not chromatic, meaning that they could only play a few select notes. If you think of bugle calls, they're very kind of bouncy around. Bump, bump, ba-da-dum, bump, bump, ba-da-dum, bump, bump. They're not playing melodies. Like violins or woodwinds or keyboard instruments did. And so the way that they became chromatic or were able to play all those notes is through the use of valves. All right? And then the valves are essentially these kind of button-looking things that you see on the instrument. And so most brass instruments use valves to do this. When you push the valve down, it diverts your air into extra tubing. That extra tubing makes the instrument longer, therefore changes the pitch of the instrument. And so through the combination of no valves, 1, 2, or 3 valves, you can play all the notes in the scale, all the same notes that a woodwind instrument or a string instrument could play. Now the trombone is of course the exception to this. Most people are familiar with what a trombone looks like. That's the one where you use the slide and it goes. That literally just moves the whole instrument to make it longer or shorter. Now the other important feature of all brass instruments is the use of a flared bell at the end of the instrument. So the original purpose of brass instruments was to be loud and to be heard across great distances. So for example, in ancient times, the only way you can communicate to your whole village is with a brass instrument, something very loud. Percussion were also used for this as well. But they would have signals for, it's 9 o'clock and all is well, go to bed. It's the city is on fire, take cover, or the city is being invaded. And of course, the military used brass instruments for much the same purpose. Move left, move right, retreat, etc. And incidentally, being a military bugler was a very dangerous job because as the communications officer, essentially, you were the communications for your entire regiment. So if the enemy wanted to confuse your regiment, they'd take you out. So you were a target as a military bugler. And so there was actually a certain way that you had to learn to be a bugler, and because it involved a lot of diplomacy as well, and essentially how not to get shot. So using those bells, brass instruments are what we call directional, meaning that wherever you point your instrument, that's where the bulk of the sound goes. So if I want my sound to go that way, that's where I'm going to point. Now, of course, the exception to this is the French horn, which has a bell that points backwards. And there's some other aspects of the French horn that we won't get into at this time. But the idea being that wherever the sound goes, that's where I want, or wherever I want the sound to go, that's where I point my instrument. As you can see, it's essentially designed to send the sound forward. So with all these brass instruments, essentially they were built very crudely up until about the Industrial Revolution. And once the Industrial Revolution began, we were able to mass produce brass instruments. I shouldn't say crudely, they were just made more slowly, and we could make them a lot faster once industry picked up. We could make them more quickly, more cheaply, better construction, they were more affordable, so we had lots more people picking up brass instruments starting in the Industrial Revolution. And so with all these brass players running around, industry in the United Kingdom in particular picked up on this and started forming brass bands. Now the reason they did this was that they were afraid that their workers in their off hours would start to form radical political groups. And so they created these brass bands basically to just keep them busy, which worked, and it also served the purpose of fostering morale among the workers, created good relationships with the local towns because they had these concerts every so often. And so generally the collieries or the coal mines were the really big proponents of these brass bands. And so you'll actually hear the term sometimes a colliery band, because that is essentially what a brass band was in the United Kingdom. Other industries used it as well, but the coal mines were really the big push behind the banding movement. Now the banding movement in the United Kingdom reached its heyday in the early 20th century, and it was estimated by some brass band experts that about 20,000 people were involved in a brass band in one way or another in the United Kingdom. Now that has since declined significantly, largely because starting around the 1980s, coal mines in the United Kingdom started to be closed. And as coal mines closed, there was no support for the brass band that was associated with it, so the brass bands ended as well. Now a number of those brass bands still exist. They opted to continue on their own and be professional organizations, and so they support themselves just like every other professional organization does. Ticket sales, merchandise sales, donations, etc. Now in the United States, the brass band movement grew up in an entirely different way. In the 1840s and 1850s, we had local brass bands that were loosely aligned with the local militias. And of course, the Civil War began in the early 1860s, and those town bands became military bands, essentially. And so they were used, again, they were loud, so they were used outside and were used to recruit new soldiers. They were used to improve morale of the troops, if they, entertain them during long encampments, play something to kind of rally them if things were going poorly in battle. And so they had a lot of different purposes, and they were very different from the brass bands in the United Kingdom. They used some slightly different instruments. So some of these instruments that you see here in the picture were only really used in this period of time and only in the United States. So if you notice in this picture here, you've got the mouthpiece here, which would go in front of you, and then the bell goes behind you. And so we lovingly call these instruments backward blasters. And the reason being is that they literally played behind you. Because when you were a brass band, a military brass band in the Civil War, you tended to march in front of the troops. And so in order for the troops to hear you, you had to put your bell behind you. And so they played some slightly different tunes as well. The brass bands in the United Kingdom tended to play what we call art music, whereas the brass bands in the United States during the Civil War tended to play more popular tunes, polkas and waltzes, things that, again, would keep the troops happy. So just like we have Civil War reenactors that go out and reenact battles, we also have Civil War brass bands that exist. And so they actually have done some recordings of period music on period instruments. And so we're going to just take a quick listen to some of that. And so you'll find that it sounds a bit different from what you would think of as a brass band. So it still sounds like a brass band, but certainly not like a modern brass band. So again, that was a very typical sound for the brass band. And there are still a few of these in existence, these Civil War reenactment bands, and the Federal City is one of them. Let's see, let me go back to here we go. Let's get through that. There we go. And then the final arm of brass band history is the Salvation Army brass bands. So around the time the Civil War was ending in the United States, there was a religious movement beginning in the United Kingdom. A minister named William Booth and his wife began this movement called the Salvation Army. And of course, branches grew up in the United States as well. And they looked to spread their Christian message through music. And since a lot of their meetings were outdoors, again, they needed something loud that could be heard without amplification. So they used brass. And so even today, there are still Salvation Army bands, and they are generally all brass. They have brass bands at the local level or regional level, and then major cities have what are called staff bands, which are just basically professional level musicians. They are all Salvationists themselves. Very few, if any of them, actually get paid, but they do very fine brass band music, and most of it tends to be Christian and religious in nature. And so again, that's just kind of the three wings of brass bands. But today, there are not nearly as many brass bands as there once were. Salvation Army bands still exist here and there, as I just mentioned. But of course, after the Civil War in the United States, there wasn't really much need for the town bands like there was during the Civil War. And so most of those bands kind of went away, and now we just have a handful. There are several amateur ensembles, meaning that there are musicians in there that don't get paid, or that are more hobbyists rather than professional. But they can generally still put out a good amount of sound and a pretty decent quality as well. There are a couple local brass bands that are amateur. There's the Allegheny Brass Band near Pittsburgh and the Franklin Silver Cornet Band, which is not too far from here. But in terms of professional level brass bands, there's only just a few. The most well-known is the Brass Band of Battle Creek. That is out of Battle Creek, Michigan, of course. And so essentially it is musicians who play at the highest level, essentially famous trumpet players, famous euphonium players, really amazing musicians. But the catch is they only play a few concerts a year. Most of these musicians live elsewhere in the country or in other countries, and so they'll just fly in to Battle Creek for a couple of days, rehearse, play a concert, and they'll do that maybe 3 or 4 times a year. So you have very high quality, very low quantity. Now there's also a brand new brass band that is just getting started in the Greensboro area of North Carolina, called the North Carolina Brass Band. It actually was founded by a former River City Brass performer who was transplanted down to North Carolina. And again, they're using professional quality musicians. And since they're just getting started, they are only playing a few concerts a year, but they are looking to increase that. So if you're traveling to North Carolina in the near future, kind of look them up and see if there's a concert going on. They're generally playing kind of the Memorial Day schedule, Christmas, and I think one more in the fall. But they'll do 2 or 3 concerts around the Greensboro area for each of those periods of time. And then, of course, River City Brass, the band that I play with. River City Brass was founded in 1981 by a man named Robert Burnett, who was a composer and a conductor and performer in the Pittsburgh area. Now, in 1976, an actual British brass band came over to the States as part of the bicentennial celebration, and Bob Burnett was asked to compose a piece for this band, which he did, and he'd never actually worked with a brass band before, and so upon meeting this group and hearing them, he was really fascinated by it. And after this, he actually took an entire year of his life and went over to the United Kingdom and just immersed himself in the brass band tradition, just followed these bands around and learned all he could about it. And when he came home, he started River City Brass. He basically gathered up musicians and got everything going. And so, River City Brass is what I like to call a modified British style. And there's really only one reason for that, and that has to do with our use of French horns. So we use French horns, whereas British brass bands use what's called a tenor horn, which is what this gentleman is playing here on the right. So as you can see, they look very different. They play the same parts, but the tenor horn is designed, of course, the bell up. It sends the sound up and out for a more diffuse sound, whereas horns, even though they go backwards, you can actually get a lot more power from those horns. They can just put out an awful lot of sound. And so essentially when Bob Burnett started the group, he said, hey, you guys use these tenor horns? And the horn players basically said, no, we're not going to do that. The downside to the tenor horn is that, first of all, it's an entirely different fingering system than the French horn players had spent their whole lives using. So it would have been like, here, read this in another language, essentially. And then there's some tuning issues with the tenor horn that if you grew up with it, it's fine, but if you're starting it brand new, it would have been much more difficult. So we've played French horns ever since, and that's why. So we do a lot of different kinds of music, but the vast majority of the concerts that we play are what we call subscription concerts. So subscription meaning that subscribers essentially pay a single fee at the beginning of the season, and they buy tickets to 4, 5, 7 shows, something like that. And that's, for the subscriber themselves, cheaper than buying an individual ticket every month. So our subscription concerts, we play at the same 5 venues 7 times a year. So on a Thursday night in September, we'll play Carnegie Hall. Friday night, we'll play Carson Middle School. Saturday night, we'll play the Palace Theater in Greensburg. And then October, we'll do the same thing. We'll do the same schedule. Entirely new show, but same schedule of concerts. And so basically, if you're a subscriber, you can look forward to basically the same time of the month the River City Brass comes, you can go to a concert. Anything else that's not a subscription concert is what we call a run-out. And those runouts can be elsewhere in Pittsburgh, it can be elsewhere in the United States, it can be an international tour. We've done very few international tours. They did a very large one to Australia back in the early 80s, and they did a quick tour to Italy with a small number of people just a couple of years ago. But as you can imagine, there's a great deal of expense involved with an international tour, so we don't do that quite as often as we'd like. But on our concerts, whether a subscription or a run-out, we play a number of different kinds of things. probably the main bulk of what we play are what's called transcriptions.
Yeah.
Some of the people you'll see in this are actual brass banders. There are, of course, a few actors in here as well. The conductor is an actor. The way he conducts, no one would actually do that. So don't take that to heart. But this is a real brass band performing this. This is the Grimethorpe Band performing William Tell. Okay, so you might have caught, there's a very young Ewan McGregor in there. He's in this movie as well. But again, it still sounds like it's the William Tell Overture, but of course, the cornets get all the fast notes that the violins play. Now, let's see here. Oh, I forgot to set up that link, but that's okay. Let's run through here. There we go. Okay, so other than transcriptions, we also have original works. These are pieces that are composed directly for the brass band. Very often there's a lot of British composers that do this, which makes sense because there was a lot of brass bands in England and Scotland. And so very often these original works can be very challenging. They kind of take to heart the fact that the cornets can play really fast notes, and so they give us a lot of fast notes. But what's really nice about them is that it's something that's just ours, and that if somebody else wants to play it, they got to rearrange it for orchestra or something like that. But in addition to the transcriptions and original works, we have solos and duos and trios. The picture we see down here is actually what we call a cornet feature. And that's when somebody in the band gets up and plays in front of the band. And basically, it will do something like Bugler's Holiday or some other famous solo that just kind of features one or more players. And then finally, we have what I like to call shtick or comedy. So this will take, oh, I do have it set up, don't I? No, I don't. So this might take a minute for the link to load. So while it's doing that, I'll kind of tell you about that. There it is. I'll pause it for just a second. So comedy, right? We'll take either a very funny tune, or we'll take a serious tune and make it funny. And so we generally will incorporate some sort of visual thing. You'll see here we've got our percussionist up in front of the band. He's going to play on these little bells here. And then there's going to be a few more surprises. So this is the Saber Dance, which many of you might recognize as it's a pretty famous tune. But generally, we've done this comedy stuff so much that our audience actually comes to expect it. We don't dare do a show that's all serious anymore. Like, people would riot in their seats, I think. So this is a bit long. It's about 3 minutes, but I think you'll enjoy it. So here's Saber Dance, as performed by River City. So while they're moving around, what you're about to see after euphoniums play their little bit here is what we call the euphonium bottle trick. It's hard to see because a little bit goes off camera, but it involves a water bottle being tossed. So you'll see a little bit here. So watch toward the top of your screen for what happens next. All right, so there's just a few seconds left, but you kind of get the idea. It's pretty typical for at least one person to be in a costume. We very rarely get out of a concert without somebody in a costume. So again, oops, let me skip ahead here. So that's kind of what makes River City Brass a bit different than some other groups, is that we do that comedy, and it helps develop a rapport with the audience. Very often our audience members just come to know us by name. They've been coming so long. When I was pregnant with my daughter, I had people come up to me, and then when I came back after giving birth, it's all these people who I didn't know would come up and be like, was it a boy or a girl? And so like people will just call me by name, and I don't know who they are, but it's just, that's the rapport that we have with our audience. So finally, just a little bit about, you saw all the people on stage, so kind of what you saw on with all those instruments. We have 28 people in our band. Brass bands can be anywhere from 25 to 28, give or take. And we are made up of brass and percussion. So the percussion are actually spread out all across the back. They'll take up the entire back of the stage because they have a drum set and timpani and marimbas and xylophones, et cetera, et cetera. But going from the front, we have the soprano trumpet or soprano cornet, depending on the band. And that's very much like the piccolo, that it's the highest voice in the band. And so you'll hear him really pretty much above everything else. And surrounding him are the rest of the cornets. With 9 members, we are by far the largest section in the band, but that section is actually divided into further subsections. So the front line is the solo cornets, of which I'm seat number 3 on this diagram. And so the solo cornets can be all playing the same part, or we can play 4 different parts, just depending on the piece. It's a pretty versatile section. And in the back row cornets, those are the supporting and all kinds of really important stuff that the band couldn't do without. And then in seat number 5, we have what's called the flugelhorn. So for those of you who may not know what a flugelhorn, I brought one to show here. They are, believe it or not, these 2 instruments, this is a cornet, these 2 instruments are exactly the same size. If you unwind them, it's the exact same amount of tubing. And so it can play all the same notes that this instrument plays. But of course, it's got a much bigger bell, it's a much wider tubing, so it has a different sound. So I'm going to play just a couple of notes on both of these so you can hear the difference. And so I'm going to try and, hopefully it won't be too loud in here. So there's a cornet, and then the same thing on a flugelhorn. So it's a much mellower tone. I like to think of it as if, you know, a trumpet and a French horn had a baby. You get the flugelhorn. It's much kind of silkier tone. And so it's kind of used for, you'll actually see it used in jazz a lot because of that. And so rounding out the rest of the band, we have 3 horns, as I mentioned earlier. We also have on the other side of the band the euphoniums, who are essentially like a small tuba, but they are the tenor voice of the band, and they also serve a main melodic purpose. Basically, when the cornets aren't playing the melody, the euphoniums are. And the baritones, again, are very similar to euphoniums. They're just a little bit smaller. 3 trombones, one of which is a bass, and 4 tubas across the back. Now, keep in mind that this is just one possible setup. This is, when I joined the band, this is kind of how we sat, but we've sat in about 4 different other configurations since then. Some of it is, depending on what we're playing, that we might need the cornets all across the front, like all 9 of us. So we might kind of move around. Or it could just be the director likes it better for a while, and so he just changes it. And so I think that kind of brings me to the end of my talk. So thank you all for coming again, and if there's any questions, I am happy to answer them.
When did you start all of this?
On the trumpet? Or just when did I start in brass band? I started playing, I think I was 7 years old, which is a little early, but my dad was a trumpet player. And so I just kind of followed my dad around, and I guess they picked up on that and got me some lessons. So I've been playing for pretty much almost all of my life at this point. So it's been, yeah.
You played any gigs with Chad Winkler?
I have, actually, yeah. I know Chad. He's played in the brass band a number of times, and actually I sat next to his brother for 7 years. His brother Jordan used to sit in seat number 2 until just very recently. So yeah, Chad's a good guy. Yeah.
So when public schools are looking to make cuts, music is one of the areas that they feel that would be superfluous.
Mm-hmm.
How can we combat that, knowing what we know about statistics of how well students do on testing and in general everything?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, if I had the absolute answer, then I'd probably be president of the United States right now. But one of the things that River City does is we have some outreach in education. We have a youth brass band, actually, called the River City Youth Brass Band. And so basically just giving kids an outlet when there may not be one in school. So in addition to the youth brass band, there's also a Saturday morning music program that is sponsored by River City that is actually open to all instruments, not just brass. Because we want students to be able to play. We also want to create informed audience members. That even if you don't make music your career, because at this point it's really hard to try and steer a student that way. Like it's disingenuous for me as a teacher to say, oh yeah, you can totally be a music player, it'll be fine. Because it's really hard. And all of us have to wear several hats. I mean, I could not make a living just doing the brass band. And none of our guys and gals in the group do. So we're a full-time brass band, but none of us do that full-time. And so we have the education, we all teach lessons. And it's just trying to get the word out there as best you can. I mean, if there's enough students that are playing in the band, it's not superfluous anymore, right? What makes it superfluous is when you have particularly parents who aren't supportive. I mean, as a teacher, I've had students who are great players and their parents are just like, whatever, and that's fine, but they're not going to have their talent fostered. And so if we can kind of get students involved in things, get young players involved, like the brass band, youth brass band, things like that, then suddenly it won't be superfluous anymore because there'll be more students playing in schools, and then the band will be something interesting and fun to look at and hear. In Texas, for example, where I did my doctoral work, band is basically a sport. They compete at a very high level. They have huge bands. They actually have multiple bands and multiple band directors. Very often I would hear, oh, so-and-so got hired as the 3rd band director at such and such a school, because they have huge programs there. And that's kind of maybe the way that it needs to happen, that we need to start having more competitions, perhaps, because that's basically why it's so big down there, is that everybody competes. I mean, it's hard because there's a lot of pressure with that competition, but you can't argue with the results either. Yep, I did all the way through. I did actually quit marching band my senior year. I should have to admit that because I was doing a lot of stuff in Philadelphia at the time. I grew up on the eastern end of the state, and so I was doing some essentially other gigs that were kind of more geared toward what I was aiming for as a professional musician. So I still played in my high school orchestra and did some stuff at school, but I had to cut marching band. It was just too much. So, yeah.
Where did you graduate?
I did my undergrad at Ithaca College, my master's at Florida State, and my doctorate at North Texas in Denton. So I bounced around quite a bit, but in 3 very different schools, but all really great teachers. And that's kind of, are you a musician yourself? Are you looking to do music at some point?
Yeah, with Mr. Winkler at Slippery Rock.
Oh, okay. You're at Slippery Rock right now? That's great, because he's awesome. Because and probably he will tell you the same thing, that if you're looking to do grad work, that you probably want to go to a different type of school, but it's most important that you have a good rapport with the teacher. And that's how I chose my schools, is I would go and take a couple lessons with the teacher, and it's like, yep, this is where I want to go. Yep, that's exactly the right way to do it. And also if you're going for grad work, this is far down the road for you, try and get a teaching assistantship as well, so you can actually do some teaching. Because I think all of us in the band, we all teach private lessons as well. That's just part of the gig, is that you do some private lessons on the side. Any other questions?
Did you take piano as well?
I took a little piano in college, actually. I didn't start piano until it was kind of clear that I was going to be doing kind of music teaching and doing like music theory and things like that. And piano is pretty important, and I still pretty well stink at the piano, but I can get by for my classes. And for the really complicated stuff, I use the computer. Because I've actually learned to just punch stuff into notation software, and it plays it for me without mistakes. So piano is a good skill to have too. And I will probably, when the time comes, I will probably start my daughter on piano first rather than a brass instrument. Because it's always something you can have kind of in the back. You can always add to piano, but piano is a really good bass line.
And developmentally, is there an age, like you said, you were young at 7, what developmentally?
They tend to start folks in 4th or 5th grade, and particularly for brass instruments, the only downside of starting early is that some people don't necessarily have all their front teeth, or they don't have their adult teeth yet. And so as you might imagine, as a brass player in a woodwind as well, dentition is kind of important. And so it's not a huge deal early on, but if you can kind of if you start them before their permanent teeth are in, they're not going to have as steady an embouchure, perhaps. I mean, I worked it out. It was fine for me. I also knocked my front teeth out when I was 10, so I have caps on my front teeth. It was a sport injury. I didn't play that sport very much longer.